When working with array fields in an aggregation pipeline, it's often necessary to include one or more unwind stages. Unwind allows us to take documents as input that have an array valued field and produce output documents such that there's one output document for each element in the array. So in this example, we have an input document that has 3 keys and values. The third key has an array as its value with elements 1, 2, and 3. Unwind, if run on this type of input document and configured to unwind the key 3 field, will produce documents that look like this. The thing that might not be intuitive to you about this is that in each of these output documents, there will be a key 3 field, and that key 3 field will have a single value rather than an array value, 1 for each one of the elements that were in this array. If there were 10 elements in this array, unwind would produce 10 output documents. So let's go back to our company's examples and take a look at the use of unwind stages. So if you'll remember, this query produces documents that have arrays for both amount and year because we're accessing the raised amount and the funded year for every element within the funding rounds array. To fix this, we can include an unwind stage before our project stage in this aggregation pipeline and parameterize this by saying that we want to unwind the funding rounds array. Returning again to our document and looking at funding rounds, we know that for each funding round, there is a raised amount field and funded year field. So unwind will, for each one of the documents that are elements of the funding rounds array, produce an output document. Now in this example, our values are strings, but regardless of the type of value for the elements in an array, unwind will produce an output document for each one of these values, such that the field in question will have just that element. In the case of funding rounds, that element will be one of these documents as the value for funding rounds for every document that gets passed on to our project stage. The result then of having run this is that now we get an amount and a year, 1 for each funding round for every company in our collection. What this means is that our match produced many company documents, and each one of those company documents results in many documents, 1 for each funding round found within every company document. Unwind performs this operation using the documents handed to it from the match stage, and all of these documents then for every company are passed through to our project stage. So all documents where the funder was Greylock will be split into a number of documents equal to the number of funding rounds for every company that matches this filter, and each one of those resulting documents will then be passed along to our project. Now, unwind produces an exact copy of every one of the documents that it receives as input. All fields have the same key and value with one exception, and that is that the funding rounds field, rather than being an array of funding rounds documents, instead has a value that is a single document, which is an individual funding round. So a company that has 4 funding rounds will result in unwind creating 4 documents, where every field is an exact copy except for the funding round field, which will, instead of being an array for each of those copies, will instead be an individual element from the funding round array from the company document that unwind is currently processing. So unwind has the effect of outputting to the next stage more documents than it receives as input. What that means is that our project stage now gets a funding rounds field that, again, is not an array but is instead a nested document that has a raised amount field and a funded year field. So project will receive multiple documents for each company matching this filter and can therefore process each of those documents individually and identify an individual amount and year for each funding round for every company. So now what I'd like to do is illustrate this by adding an additional field to our output documents. And in doing so, we'll actually identify a little bit of a problem with this aggregation query as currently written. So what I'm going to do here is add a funder field, and this will access the investments field of the funding rounds embedded document that it gets from unwind. And for the financial organization, give me the permalink. Note that this is very similar to what we're doing here in terms of our filter. I just want to make sure that the funder actually matches what we stipulated here. In general, when you're building aggregation queries, it's a good idea to put in checks as you're constructing them to make sure they're doing what you think they're doing. So let's run this, and let's have a look at our output. In order to understand what we're seeing here, we need to go back to our document and look at the investments field. Remember that what we're doing here is accessing the investments field of the funding rounds embedded document. If we take a look at what investments is, we can see that it is itself an array. And we can see that multiple funders can participate in each funding round. So investments will list every one of those funders. So going back to our example and looking at the results, what we're seeing here is that as we originally saw with the raised amount and funded year, we're now seeing an array for funder because investments is an array valued field. And as we know, the semantics for a project on an array valued field is to produce all of the values for whatever field we've stipulated. Something I'd like to point out here is the results for Faircast. If we take a look at Faircast, we can see that for these two documents that were produced, we have in fact a match for Greylock. But the funder for this particular output document does not list Greylock among the funding organizations. If in fact we do a query for Faircast and just print out the funding rounds, we can see that there are 3 funding rounds. The first one was funded by Madrona Venture Group and WRF Capital, no Greylock included. The second one does include Greylock Partners as well as Madrona again and WRF Capital again. And the third one includes Greylock, Madrona, and several other funders, including WRF Capital. So what we're seeing from our aggregation query matches that exactly. The problem is that we're seeing a funding round for Faircast here that Greylock did not participate in. This is because, in specifying our query, we're simply looking for companies that have any funding round that Greylock participated in. What I'd like to do is constrain my results so that I'm only seeing as output funding rounds that Greylock participated in, not all the companies for which Greylock participated in at least one. So in order to do that, what I'm going to have to do is figure out a way to filter this further. One possibility is reverse the order in which I'm doing my unwind and match. That is to say, do the unwind first and then do the match. What this guarantees is that I will only match documents coming out of unwind that represent funding rounds that Greylock actually participated in. So if I run that, we see a slight delay, but then we see that all of the output here actually does in fact indicate that the funding organization, that Greylock was among the funders. And in fact, I can make this a little bit easier to see if I include a second unwind so that each of the investors are themselves broken out into separate documents. And now I can see that I'm only seeing documents where funding organization was in fact Greylock throughout all of the results. And as I iterate through them, that will continue to be the case. But in thinking through this query, we have to ask ourselves, what are these two unwind stages seeing? And given that there's no filter specified, this unwind is actually running through the entire collection, as is this one. What we want to do is have our match operation occur as early as possible so that for each stage in our pipeline, we're working with as few documents as possible. So I don't really want to do something like this. What I can do instead is leave this filter as the first stage in my pipeline and simply include a second match. What's going to happen here is that we'll go ahead and filter for companies where Greylock participated in at least one funding round. We'll then unwind the funding rounds and the investment nested array, and then finally filter again so that any funding rounds, any documents that represent funding rounds that Greylock did not participate in will be removed from what's passed on to project. So as I mentioned when we first discussed the aggregation framework, it's often the case that we need to include multiple stages of the same type. This is a good example of that, in that we're filtering to reduce the number of documents that we're looking at initially by narrowing down our set of documents for consideration to those for which Greylock participated in at least one funding round. But then through our unwind stages, we end up with a number of documents that represent funding rounds from companies that Greylock did in fact fund, but individual funding rounds that Greylock did not participate in. So we can get rid of all the funding rounds we're not interested in by simply including another filter here using a second match stage. And now if we run this, we'll see that Greylock is the only organization output here, but our operation runs much more quickly because it's processing far fewer documents through each stage of the pipeline. So a couple of things to take away from this lesson. For the array field specified in an unwind stage, unwind will produce a number of output documents equal to the number of elements included in that field for each document it processes. So in this case, we had 3 elements in our key3 field, and we produced 3 output documents. Unwind will use the individual array element as the value for the array valued field in the original document in each one of the output documents. This is why, in our example, we had 1 output document for each funding round for every company. It's also important to keep in mind that in many circumstances, you'll want to use multiple stages of the same type in an aggregation pipeline. Remember that each stage simply takes a set of documents as input and performs its defined operation on those input documents. So if you build up your pipeline one stage at a time, consider its input and consider its output, it's typically pretty straightforward to determine what stage should be next in our pipeline, given our goals for a given aggregation query.